Good afternoon, everyone. And well, first, my thanks to the conference organizers, Roman, Lietz, and further Lynn, for inviting me to give this talk. I'm delighted to do it because it also offers me an opportunity to clarify some of my ideas on sociocultural change today and to address this question of the post-digital, which is something I hadn't really thought too much about, but it did force me to well, situate my ideas in relation to this concept. Yeah. Now, one of the problems of giving an online talk is that unless you master the technology better than I do, you not only don't see the conference participants, but you unfortunately have to see yourself, which is somewhat a different situation, shall we say. Yeah, so my talk is how to understand sociocultural change today. I want to discuss the big picture of major transformations in the sociocultural makeup of contemporary society, and yeah, with a focus on the specificity of the European context, because, well, one has to refer to something without making too many qualifications about, where it applies to. And yeah, in view of the interest in the digital, post-digital, in relation to Europeanism, I prefer to talk about Europeanization, but maybe that's a pedantic point. I will try to give some attention to the claim that we're living in a post-digital age, or what that might possibly mean. Now, I've already used the term sociocultural to highlight the fact that culture, not just today, but in any time in history, is something that can't be separated from the social domain in the way that the older and now, I think, largely discredited views of culture once took for granted. The idea of a high culture uncontaminated by society, or the idea of cultural anarchy, or some kind of a mismatch between the cultural sphere and social reality. And of course, the old Marxist view of culture as an epiphenomenon. Now, just as a conceptual starting point, I want to say that I see culture, since that's what we're talking about, and a term that's impossible to pin down, but let me say that at least sociologically, I see culture, the whole sphere of beliefs, values, meanings, traditions, identities, all of that, entailing symbolic, normative, ethical, cognitive dimensions. It contains the imaginary and is the site of learning. And we know from phenomenological sociology that culture consists of practices. It's performative and constructed, in the sense that it's not fixed or given. And of course, it's contested. It's the side of struggle over power and meaning. Yeah. So when I talk about culture, that's pretty much what I have in mind. But I also want to make a second kind of conceptual starting point to assert, from a more sociological perspective, that an analytical distinction needs to be made that distinguishes the cultural dimension of society from the structural, broadly economy, state, biochemical and material foundation of society, and also from the political, an analytical distinction. In reality, of course, they're not separated in reality, but they have to be analytically separated. And I think these distinctions are important because cultural change can occur before, or it can occur after structural change. They really relate to each other in complex ways. So on the basis of that conceptual starting point, I want to say there is a major transformation in the structural context today. So I want to talk about cultural change, sociocultural change, but I want to start with the primacy of the structural context, because there's the argument I'm going to give for that is this: we're in a period that can be characterized as the end of stability. At least as far as Europe, at least especially the Western European societies are concerned. The period since 1945 was one of exceptional stability and one in which a kind of peace reigned. To be sure, it was the European peace and one in which several dictatorships survived. Now, the social world was based on industrial capitalism, the structures of the Cold War, highly rigid gender divisions, fairly strong social institutions like the family and churches that domesticated society. Now, that structural context has gone. It entered into a crisis in the mid-1970s, and then with the rise of neoliberalism, the fall of the European dictatorships, the Western ones, Spain, Portugal, and then the Warsaw Pact countries, but with the end of the Cold War, globalization, etc., that context has gone. Now, two main perspectives seem to be dominate any account of social change. One that sees change occurring within a broader situation of stability, continuity, or persistence as the dominant trend, and one that sees the present in terms of crisis and transformation. And the former position, I think, has been refuted by historical events. The current situation is marked by a strong sense of rupture that comes with the end of the era of stability, and not just crisis, but it's a new concept of perma-crisis, where a plurality of crises morph into one big ongoing crisis, a perma-crisis. Now, this is not primarily one of cultural change on its own, or socio-cultural change, but two of structural change, as well as, of course, political change. The model of capitalism that developed with neoliberalism, essentially one of global markets, globalization and the dominance of financial capitalism, has entered into a serious crisis with a return to protectionism and with that political authoritarianism. In Streeck's terms, I am referring to Wolfgang Streeck, the German economic sociologist, political sociologist. Capitalism is quite literally running out of time, having successfully postponed the day of reckoning through various strategies of buying time. In addition, there's the dual crisis of climate change and the energy crisis, the latter, of course, exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. And all of this amounting to a perma-crisis. Now, the result of this situation is a deep division in most societies between those who Zygmunt Bauman described as the winners and the losers of globalization. But there are many examples, of course, with all variations, of a 50-50 divide in most democracies between what can be, I think, better characterized as the conflict between the post-national political community and the nationalist one. In other words, there's a new division between those who largely identify with national culture and those whose horizons have been extended beyond the limits of the traditional markers of belonging, such as those of class and nation. And in the context of the post-2008-10 crisis, upheaval, this set the conditions for further cultural and political clashes between two very broad spectrums of the population, the nationals and the cosmopolitanisms, now subject of a great deal of sociological research. Now, this conflict plays out in different ways, including across generations, but there's a general clash between the radical or populist right, with the support of the extreme right, and the center ground, as well as the left. But I think, additionally, one must say that both of these sides are themselves now ever more internally divided. Capitalism has produced a new class of the precariat and has underlined, let me say, has eroded, I mean to say, the conditions that the middle class previously enjoyed, the conditions of security that the middle class has previously enjoyed, above all, eroding the traditional markers of social status. However, this is not just a cultural clash, as in the notion of cultural wars. It's driven by the transformation in work and insecurity, and precarity is now extending into the middle class. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated these trends, and there's now the new context of the war in Ukraine. That's going to be watching, trying to predict the future. It's my business to do so, but I would like to suggest that that's likely, very likely, to become much more important. But as we've seen, extraordinary events in Russia on Saturday that were basically in Act One there of something that's going on with an uncertain in an uncertain course, but with the ever present danger of an escalation, of course, leading to nuclear war. But the more likely prospect of a forever war between Ukraine and hence Europe on the one side, and on the other, the Russian Federation, assuming it survives the crisis that it's currently in. Now, this situation has led to a new Iron Curtain, a kind of a new one at least, and a new global division that reorganizes the multipolar world that seemed to be emerging in the 1990s. So a new kind of, a new global division basically between the United States and China, and it's not very clear where Russia is going to be in that new global world. According to Branko Milosevic, there are now two types of capitalism competing with each other: a liberal meritocratic one, and a political authoritarian capitalism. And of course, this clash underpins the reorganization of the global context. So what I'm saying here so far is that I don't think any account of cultural change can ignore the structural situation, both in national societies and in the wider global context and the major crises over time, and this sort of emerging perma-crisis. On that basis, let me now try to outline some aspects of socio-cultural change today. So what comes to mind as key markers of socio-cultural change, with the emphasis on the structural transformation that's going on. Well, what comes to mind? The digital, generational shifts, cosmopolitanism, post-material values, including lifestyles and identities. What else? Climate change, perhaps. It's a very cultural matter, not just political or structural, in that it also has an existential dimension. Now, before going to the digital and the vexed question of the post-digital, let me begin by addressing the notion of a post phenomenon. There's lots of post this and post that going on here. I've already invoked post, I think twice. Post material, I just said there a moment ago, and I could easily add post to cosmopolitanism. What would that mean? What does it mean to say something is post? And is it really a helpful term? Let me clarify the conceptual aspect of calling something post. I think I need to do that. As I understand it, the prefix post, in the most meaningful sense possible, indicates, it can mean three things, of which the first, I think, is the most meaningful. First of all, it indicates that something is at a sufficiently advanced stage, whereby the continued use of the term without the qualification post would only see the old form and not the emerging new form, which contains elements of the old and the new, essentially the understanding of postmodernism, the mix of the old and the new. But it can also imply, secondly, a stronger critique of the phenomenon in question, whatever it might be, as redundant concept to describe something that has ceased to exist. Or thirdly, possibly something that in fact never existed, so thus if it never existed, the thing couldn't cease to exist. It's just an illegitimate category. Thus, to take the most famous post concept, the postmodern, the most useful rendition of the term, I think, really was made by Zygmunt Bauman, who I've already mentioned, in one of his best books, in the late 1980s, 1987, I think, interpreters and legislators, excuse me. In that book, he defined the postmodern as a reflective stage of the modern, modernity taking a critical look at itself. Now, in that sense, it's not something fundamentally new, but central part of the modern. So that would be a good example. That's the most famous example, I suppose, of a kind of a meaningful use of the word post, something that qualifies as opposed to saying, there's something new. Because if there really is something new, then why not just call it what it is? In the second sense, I indicated another famous example here, Lyotard's in the postmodern condition. It signals the rupture with modernity, where the postmodern is no longer, where modernity is no longer a relevant term to understand the present because it has been superseded. And in this, in this vein, we have Latour's argument for a yet stronger notion in We Have Never Been Modern, that modernity is not necessarily coming to an end because it never existed in the first place. It's a mistaken and illegitimate term. In other words, it's a wrong term to begin with. Of course, Latour didn't use the term postmodern, but it was implicit in his argument and it was taken up in those terms. Now, while similar, all three notions of post have very, they're very similar meanings. With the first two, I think, really the main ones. Now, I would like to suggest that all three senses of the post can be found in the notion of the post-digital. Lack of clarity gives rise to much confusion. In my view, the most meaningful use of the term is the first one, as I said, namely the idea that the phenomenon, be it, what we're talking about, the digital modernity, America, is the notion out there of post-America, the West, I've used the term the post-West, continues, but the thing is not at an end, but it has undergone a sufficient degree of transformation that its continued use fails to recognize the changed circumstances of the present context. Now, this applies to the whole of culture and relates to the problem of the in-between, the time of crisis and transformation. I think we can discard the third sense, that it's just we're describing an illegitimate term that might be relevant to certain kinds of post-phenomenon. And the second is highly problematical, that the phenomenon is kind of passé. A further problem, of course, is that how does one know where we stand in history? This situation in Russia, like everyone is trying to figure out, whether it's the American president or the president of the Russian Federation or people on the streets in Moscow or wherever, they don't know what's going to happen. So if the post refers to the end of something at the beginning of a new era, how do we know that a new era is about to start? Maybe it's not. The Soviet Union lasted for 70 years. The Spanish dictatorship lasted 40 years. Dictatorship can go on for a very long time. We may be at the beginning of an era, as in the notion of the Anthropocene. The notion challenges the very idea of the post. Before proceeding, I would like to comment on another problem with the post concept. Since what I just argued is not really a vindication of the term, it can simply be just a bad theory. Here's why. Post arguments, as in the notion of the postmodern, or if they're good arguments, they're really, I think, corrective arguments. They're correcting a concept rather than announcing something new, because that's not quite so easy, because we're not quite sure where we are in history unless we're already in it for a long time. unless they're very strong arguments, as in Lyotard's thesis, which I think has been invalidated, that the modern has come to an end. That is to say, a post-argument is the corrective of an argument that needs to be qualified. Now, with the passage of time, the corrective position comes to be accepted as the only reasonable one. That, I think, was the sense of Baumann's position, namely a more critical and reflective interpretation of the modern, of modernity, than outright rejection and an announcement of something entirely new beginning. While I agree with this attempt to bring a stronger dimension of self-problematization to bear on the phenomenon in question in order to correct a false theory, there is the danger that one of the other senses of the term becomes, in effect, a substitute for the loss of meaning of the old term. Even if this is not the case, there's the problem that the corrective becomes, in time, the new norm, when in fact it's based on just a correction of an illegitimate theory or concept that needs to be highly qualified. My view then is that many of these post-arguments are based on bad theories, possibly even false theories of the past that have been used for too long to interpret the present. This is the case with the notion of the post-digital. However, there is a sense in which it can be a meaningful term, as in the claim that the digital revolution is now over and that digitalization is the current reality of contemporary society. This reasoning could also apply to the notion of postmodern society. The modern has arrived everywhere. It's no longer new. Maybe it was new 100 years ago, the modern, but it's no longer new. And similarly with the postmodern, maybe it was new in the 1970s, 1980s, maybe even the 1990s, perhaps it was new, but that too is a situation that has been surpassed with its normalization, shall we say. So once we're agreed on that, we can continue to use the term digital modern. Perhaps one way of putting this is that what is needed maybe here is not necessarily a concept, but a theory to account for broader processes. A concept may do that, but probably not. We maybe need a broader theory to describe a much larger context. My argument until now is not what it may seem like a highly pedantic exercise. I wanted to draw attention to an aspect of cultural change, which is that cultural change of the past 3 decades or so has now come to an end. The new has arrived, but it's nothing new anymore. That is to say, the tremendous transformation brought about by the internet, the social movements of the 1970s and the 1980s, that's been the background to so much of social theory, European integration, the end of the Cold War, globalization, and the cosmopolitanism that was a feature of the 1990s. All of this maybe has reached a point today at which these things are no longer transformative. That's obviously not to say that an end point has been reached, but their transformative potential has possibly been reached, if not exhausted. And well, maybe they have been exhausted, and these movements, in that case, have crystallized, and only their consequences remain. Let's take some examples. The new social movements that came to the fore in politics in Western societies since the 1960s have now largely exhausted their revolutionary impact. Feminism is nothing new anymore, which is not to say it's achieved all its aims, but it's not something new in the way that it once was. Emancipation can be as much the rallying call of the extreme right. It was once, the leitmotif, the central idea of the left, but everyone is now in pursuit of emancipation. The new social movements are now the old ones. What are the new ones? BLM, remember that? Eco movements, perhaps, as regards progressive politics. Take Europeanization, or if you want, Europeanism. Europeanization. The post-Second World War project of European integration is widely believed to be in crisis today. But really, is it? I don't think it really is in crisis. It's reached a particular point at which it's achieved many of its old objectives. Of course, examples of crisis tendencies, are there. They would include the increased importance of non-compliant members, Hungary, the re-election of Orban in Hungary, the situation with Serbia and its relation with Russia, sleaze in the European Parliament, the weakening of internal cohesion, the calamity of Brexit, weakening of the enlargement project. The Eastern enlargement seems to have stalled, but not necessarily come to an end. Turkey's probably permanently out. And then there's others kind of frozen, like Serbia and Montenegro. There's uncertainty around Kosovo. Rise of new authoritarian regimes, Prussia and, of course, in the extreme and so on, also Turkey. Now, I don't think this means that Europeanization is a terminal crisis or even is in a deep legitimacy problem. On the contrary, many, as I said, of its objectives, for example, peace between France and Germany, have been realized. New problems inevitably arise when the old ones have been solved. In many ways, its success, the success of the European project, have led to the onset of new ones. And that's kind of normal, as with any political project. Project is probably also the wrong term to use here. European integration is simply an accomplished fact. It's no longer a project, is what I mean. European societies have been irreversibly Europeanized. And that's true too of Brexit Britain, which I've always argued is a highly Europeanized country, despite Brexit. Of course, it was precisely that gave rise to Brexit. In fact, Brexit, aside from being a catastrophe for the United Kingdom, is an example of a failed project. It's now officially failed, demonstrating the demonstration of the impossibility of leaving the EU is now a fact, or at least the impossibility of leaving behind Europeanization, and it has served as a warning to others. Strangely, in the case of Brexit, that failure hasn't been accompanied by extensive regret. The European project has from the beginning been a multi-tiered one, and perhaps also, in the language of European political science, a multi-speed project that does not require the abolition of the nation state, but brings about, rather, its structural transformation. And so there's no turning back the clock. You can't go back to where you were 40 years ago. As with any process of integration, there will be degrees of rebalancing, of restructuring, which I think is what's going on today with European integration. And again, the notion of integration is now no longer the best term to use. It's no longer a project of integration. So I do not see a return to something historically prior, and that's surely the whole problem with Brexit. The UK did not go back to where it was before it joined. The current situation regarding the EU is rather one of partial reversals and reorientations. The EU may not be going forward to ever greater union, to use that term, but it's also not going backwards. And, well, I think a good example is the current situation since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February last year. There's been a reorientation of the EU around the common security and energy policy, which I suppose is the next phase of Europeanization. Let me give a short digression on a related matter. I've argued in various publications that Europe today is post-Western, they're another post. In the sense that it's no longer defined, Europe is no longer defined by the context of the Cold War, when it was largely shaped by the Western core states allied to the United States of America. Since 1989, Europe has been redefined in a way that encompasses the wider diversity of civilizations that have constituted its history. This is what I refer to as an intercivilizational constellation that does include Russia. Yes, it definitely includes Russia, as it does the Byzantine, Jewish, and Muslim heritages in formations of European modernity. I put that argument. The term captures the sense of multiple and entangled civilizations, as opposed to a singular and now discredited notion of Western civilization and its modern successor, the West. Inspired by Adorno's use of the term, the concept of constellation suggests a pattern that is not underpinned by a fixed or objective structure. But concerning cosmopolitanism, I'm just looking at the time. This cosmopolitanism, this is more complicated since the term has so many meanings. I do not use it in the sense of world government or the overcoming of the nation state or some highly normative term to describe a purely desirable state of affairs, as in normative political philosophy. By cosmopolitanism, I understand a condition that seeks to realize the potentials within the present through an expansion of horizons, and not just as in Gadamer's famous term, a fusion of horizons, but an expansion of horizons. The appeal of cosmopolitanism can be accounted for as an alternative to the violent nationalisms that were a feature of much of the 20th century, but also due to the desire for a normative critique of globalization. So I've seen it as a critique of globalization. Rather than being an affirmative condition or some kind of a highly normative one, it's transformative and produced by social struggles. So it resides in social struggles. It's openly the case that despite widespread anti-cosmopolitan trends in the world today, and of course these are going on, that there has been a worldwide increase in the recognition of cosmopolitan principles, and the carriers of it are more likely to be oppositional movements seeking to advance global social justice. In this sense, it's more of a bottom-up movement than one deriving from global elite culture or even transnational institutions, but of course all of these together make cosmopolitanism. The notion of a rooted cosmopolitanism has been invoked by many others to capture this notion of a kind of an everyday cosmopolitanism, which is in danger of being kind of made a little bit banal, as in a lot of really silly sociological research. The reception of cosmopolitanism in social sciences as well as in post-colonial thought, whereby cosmopolitanism becomes linked with empirical social phenomena, makes it difficult to claim that cosmopolitanism is only an elite phenomenon or something that has somehow failed, and now we're back to the nation state where we're in the throes of anti-cosmopolitanism. It's increasingly associated with the claims to rights of various groups, previously excluded from political community. But of course, there's no doubt that the current situation has seen the rise of counter or anti-cosmopolitan trends. But these do not define the present. And I would also be in agreement with the opposite view that I'm not saying that cosmopolitanism defines the present. It's a case of struggle. I'm also suggesting in line with the argument I've established that cosmopolitanism is no longer something new. But that is not to claim the present is an era of cosmopolitanism. I think that would be a wrong claim to make. Cosmopolitan currents are an inextricable part, they're deeply part of contemporary society. So too are countercurrents. So some preliminary conclusions. Yes, a significant shift in political discourse, but not a transformation in the European Union has occurred. The resurgence of nationalism, yes, has occurred, but that doesn't alter the fact that the world is more interconnected than it is divided. Anti-cosmopolitan currents have become more pronounced, but like all movements, they're fraught with contradictions. Trump is down. Well, maybe he's going to be back up again, but well, I'm not going to make a prediction there. But he's down for now. Bolsonaro is out, down and out. Putin is embattled. He was almost out a few days ago, but it was looking like that. Probably how we saw things. In the UK, Johnson is gone. Hard to see him back. So what seems to be a few years ago, one situation is now suddenly another one. The social democratic left is still there. Is it still strong? I don't know. In Spain, the election at the end of next month, well, I suppose be indicative. It's unlikely to be a happy situation, I'm afraid. And in Germany, of course, the SDB or in government. And in Portugal, Ireland, of course, is also interesting here. So the social democratic left, perhaps it's clueless, but it's not at an end. But certainly a project that is now in crisis. The 1990s saw a rise in cosmopolitanism, but a drop in labor protection, because half of cosmopolitanism was allied, can one say, with neoliberal trends, so this drop in labor protection unleashed anti-cosmopolitan trends. Now, in this whole context, maybe I can briefly comment on post-migrancy. That's been mentioned in the conference description. I know there'll be a talk to the conference on this topic, so I'm not going to say too much about it, but as a post-term, maybe I can refer to it. I assume it refers to a situation that exists in many European countries, and Fregel's initial comments make much sense to me as regards how that term might be used. It's by no means, especially in Western European post-colonial societies such as Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, countries that experience waves of migration from their former colonies since the 1950s. Now, in some cases, this includes migration from the European south to the north, and of course in Germany, the older Turkish migration to what was then West Germany. Now, in all these cases, migration transformed the societies, the host societies, such that in the case of Britain, there's no longer a discernible native culture, as in the well-known example of, what is British food. This has led to a changed understanding of multiculturalism, which is no longer premised on the existence of a majority culture that tries to accommodate minority cultures that have come from outside it. So the reality is that the majority culture has been transformed. In that sense, we have a post-migration society, or post-migration societies. That is, societies that have already been transformed by migration. So not societies that no longer have migration. That would make no sense. And that also, again, demonstrates the futility of Brexit, which was driven by the desire, or I think was probably more of a fantasy, of a specific segment of the society to return to a world in which Britain was inhabited by white people. The irony, of course, here is that most of the migrants were white people from other parts of Europe. Another feature of socio-cultural change that I would like maybe to briefly mention, put into this list of all the things that make up social cultural change today, generational change. Following Karl Mannheim's famous essay, generations are not just a group of people born at the same time, but have an identity shaped by the events that define their birth cohort. It may be a traumatic event, or it may be a major historical experience. It reveals the generations, that is, I mean to say, reveals the impact of major demographic trends. So, like the most famous generation, I guess, in second half of the 20th century, the baby boomers, especially those born the period after the Second World War up until the early 60s. I'm a late baby boomer, but I don't actually really see myself as one. That it really includes those who were born in the 1950s, but technically up to early 60s. That too includes the 1968 generation, in other words, the generation that went to university in the late 1960s. They were important agents of cultural and political change in Europe. They were the first of the baby boomers. The problem, of course, with these generational terms like baby boomers is that they were terms that were created by public intellectuals in the US. The term, I think, was created by the US Census Bureau. And then Generation X in the mid 60s to 80s, once referred to as alienated youth, coined by an author called Douglas Copeland, in a novel of the early 1990s, Generation X. Perhaps more visible today in Europe, especially the millennials or millenniums. Born, in the 1980s up to mid 1990s, coined by William Strauss and Neil Howe. And finally, Generation Z, those born in the later 1990s up to, 2010, that period. The generation that came after the boomers had to compete with larger populations, which kept wages down, according to Bobby Duff in a book called Generations. That's when you're born, shape who you are. The millenniums, brought racial and cultural diversity to the mainstream, unlike the baby boomers who were very kind of mainstream, culturally speaking, even though they were agents of change. The millennials have often been described as cultural omnivores. And then Generation Z, the Zoomers, they were the first to have grown up in a digital age and only to know how, it's part of their life. Unlike people of my generation who had to learn it from, in later life. Well, now, with some, there's a strong difference between them and their parents, especially between baby boomers and their parents. Many of them were in Germany Nazis. People of who were born before the Second World War, and those who were born after are fundamentally different. Perhaps that generational divide in relation to the children and their parents is less a feature of the generations X, millenniums, and Generation Z than millennials. The millenniums grew up in a more cosmopolitanized world, but one that was shaped by neoliberals. Generations can be characterized by a collective historical experience. These generations, of course, overlap, they coexist. They are problematical constructs because they're not really sociological. The empirical examples, the problem here is generations is a sociological concept, a really good one, but many of the examples or examples almost from popular culture, many of them are American constructions, and they're not homogeneous. They're not rigorous categories. They're in many ways products of the media. But nonetheless, generations are agents of socio-cultural change, as Karl Mannheim recognized in his classic essay. The arrival of Generation Z is perhaps the point of entry into the digital, post-digital situation. So what I'm essentially doing is placing, notions like the digital or other ones in a wider context, and that's often what you're doing in sociology and social theory, putting something into a wider context. And more generally, to interpret the current situation or the major transformations of the present time. Digital culture and digitalization is part of the fabric of social formation today. In terms of my earlier framework, you want to call it a framework, or at least a distinction, we have to see it as part of the of the structural context, the social structural context. It's not just only a cultural phenomenon. As I see it, the post-digital is not a term that can be applied to the wider society, as you know, in the sense of a post-digital era, as there are other designations over time. I don't think it can be used as a term to describe the current time. It is a term that can be used to refer to digital phenomena, namely the conversion of analog information into other forms, such as text, images, sounds, other realities, including data itself. But the notion of the post-digital does open up wider issues in the sense that it invokes other social processes that are not themselves digital only. A key point is that the current situation is one in which digitalization is no longer new and revolutionary. So going back to the definition I made earlier of post, what constitutes a post phenomenon, it has become the digital has become the new normality. So the post is, using the word post, the prefix post, seeking to qualify the newness of the digital and affirming a continuation rather than a rupture with digitalization. Because that, in my view, would make no sense. I accept that, as with other examples I mentioned, including postmodernity. However, it's perhaps worth suggesting that there may be just one sense that marks the digital as different. So I'm not going to just contradict what I said, but maybe this other stronger sense of post might be a little bit here. Perhaps it may be the case that the real revolution has yet to come. And I'm going to leave this a little bit open. I'm thinking here of the potential impact of artificial intelligence, and with all due regard to the fact that I'm not an expert in this. This may not be quite within the technological limits of the digital artificial intelligence, but it's clearly part of the technological innovation begun by digitalization. And well, there's a very specialized question. Whoops, I just accidentally hit, I want to make sure, am I still online? I am, good. I just hit my mouse by accident while I'm looking for, okay.
Yes, you're online.
All fine, thanks. Yeah, so, okay. So, there's the field of nanotechnology. So we're not going into the specifics of digitalization in relation to artificial intelligence. Now, artificial intelligence has brought the information age to a new stage, letting aside for now whether the term information age is an adequate account of contemporary capitalism or contemporary society, as Manuel Castells outlined in his famous trilogy in the late 1990s. So I venture to claim that the most significant transformation in the digital world is the advancement of artificial intelligence. This is a major, even revolutionary transformation of digitalization. The massive amount of data that digitalization generates, like the result of big data, datification, all of that, produces the need for artificial intelligence in order to make sense of the data, which is too large for the human mind. Thus, AI is given a rationale in computational decision-making. Now, this represents a step more significant than cyber reality, mediated interaction, like what we're doing here, that came with the digital revolution. Now, as I said, while it has been increasingly recognized that digitalization is becoming the new normal, and hence the notion of the post-digital in that sense, I'm not convinced that this is the case with artificial intelligence as it morphs into AGI, artificial general intelligence. We may be at an early stage in its development. If we are, we don't know. We don't really know that because we don't know where it's going to go. AGI, artificial general intelligence, refers to super artificial intelligence, whereby robots have acquired the ability to learn. I think that's what makes it, and no longer confined to performing logistical tasks given to them by humans. Unlike unlike artificial intelligence, unlike your artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence, I mean to say, is no longer dependent on humans for input. It is, in effect, no longer based on the model of a machine, but of a kind of, I'm in danger here of another post term, a post machine, an automated form of intelligence. Castell's famous account of the information society was characterized by a strong sense of the capacity of human agency to control and master it. And those who could control and master it, have a future, whereas those who don't, like the Soviet Union, then lost out. It was also compatible with cosmopolitanism and the notion of autonomy. That's often seen as the basis of modernity, the fundamental premise of freedom. But what if it were the other way around? Is there not a danger that the brave new world of robotification, artificial general intelligence represents a movement into the post-human domain, another post again here? What about some of the potential technological developments yet to come? Obviously, because they haven't come. We're in the domain of unknowns. Some of these may be benign products of human intelligence and subservient to human needs. Some might even serve human needs without being products of human intelligence, as in, certain, let me skip this point. But there are also the dystopian scenarios and potential visions of the end of humanity. The rapid rise of artificial general intelligence can be seen as a post-digital development that, while a continuation of the digital, represents a significant movement into a new context altogether. The implications of deep learning systems, artificial intelligence has the potential to perform every task better than humans. As I understand it, this is really only demonstrable in the sphere of games, such as chess. But the trend seems to be that that's just the starting point. This goes beyond the model of imitating human behavior, but pertains to action. How could such a model be made compatible with human values, or something like cosmopolitanism or democracy? What if it sees control, as Toby Orb discusses in a brilliant book, Tony Orb, Professor of Moral Philosophy, Oxford University, book called The Precipice? Says there's a real risk, and he calculates the risks. Also, what Stuart Russell says in Human Compatible book in 2019, it could lead to an existential catastrophe if it took control of the future of humanity. Now, I'm not going to talk more about these. I'll conclude now. I'm not an expert in this, but that might bring the post-digital into a slightly different domain. These scenarios, of course, examples of the long-term future, and beyond my expertise to assess as regards the implications of artificial intelligence. But they do give a sense of the direction of technological transformation that has already begun. If these prognoses are correct, we are definitely in the domain of the post-digital and the deep future. So that would be a different sense of the post-digital. One outcome of the current situation is the fragmentation of consciousness, the old theme of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. The individual lacks not a direct relation to social reality, but now possibly is in danger of lacking even a mediated one. That might be, the dystopian future. So some conclusions. Well, I'm finished now. I think I'm at my 50 minutes, more or less, and which is long enough to listen to someone talking on Zoom or anywhere, I suppose. Cultural change today is more bound up with technological change than ever before, and that's why the structural context is important. The transformation of digitalization by artificial intelligence is one of the greatest developments in the structural context. When combined with the changing political context, there are new dangers, like authoritarianism. On the other side, democracy is not static and a major force in the world. And well, I will conclude with that, and thank you very much for your attention. And I hope some of these scattered thoughts are useful. And well, thank you.